Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. Today I'll be taking you along with the process of making this 1830s evening gown. The fabric I'm using is a lovely soft embroidered faux silk. Construction begins with the skirt, and I decided to simply cut two 60-inch wide by 40-inch long lengths of fabric. 1830s skirts were often really simple, just being large rectangles pleated or gathered up to the waist measurement. I would have liked to have made the circumference larger than I did. However, due to a limited amount of fabric, I was only able to achieve a finished hem of 119 inches. The side seams of the panel are sewn down by machine using a 1/2 inch allowance. And since I used the full width of the fabric, I'm able to leave some of the seams as is, having the salvaged edge to use. That saved me from doing French seams, which is always fun. I cut a 9-inch long slash into the center back of the skirt for the closure, and I then cut 2 strips of fabric for the placket on the opening and stiffened them with a fusible interfacing, since silk can be fairly delicate. The interfacing is kept free of the seam allowances though, so not to add extra bulk. The plackets are then attached by pinning them in place and stitching them so one is folded completely inward and the other is left mostly visible. They act as a modesty panel of sorts, covering any pulling away that can happen at the closure. Next, it was time to cartridge pleat. I marked 2 rows along the top edge, evenly spaced a 1/2 inch apart. I then stitched the fabric with wide running stitches, only going through the fabric at each mark. I gathered the fabric up in 4 separate sections that way. If the thread snapped, not all my gathers would be lost, and it was also easier to handle smaller sections of fabric. So pulling both threads evenly, I reduced each section down to approximately 7 inches, then tied off the ends of the thread. I wasn't quite happy with how the pleats were sitting since they weren't very full. Cartridge pleats are supposed to be tight, like very tight, and these were not. I attached them to the waistband anyway and was absolutely unhappy with how it looked, so I decided to rip it all off and out, and then I did normal gathers instead. The waistband is made by attaching 2 piped strips of fabric onto the band and then folding them inward so the edge is nice and neatly finished like you saw there. And then it is quickly whip stitched onto the cartridge plates, but as I said, that was torn out. And then it was stitched on to the gathered edge of the pleats by hand also. The next step was to assemble and complete the front apron, which is shaped like a trapezoid. I lined it using the bagging out method and left the lining a 1/4 inch smaller than the satin, so that if the fabric lifts, the lining won't be easily visible. The fabric is stitched right sides together facing, and then turned right side out and pressed. I turned the open bottom edge into a rolled hem and secured it with whip stitches, making sure to only catch the lining fabric. At this point, I realized I made a mistake and lined the apron before I had embellished it with this lace trim, so sadly all my hand stitching won't be hidden like I would prefer it, but it will still be on the underside. It just wasn't worth me unpicking all the work I had done in order to be able to hide it. I marked placement dots and pinned this lace ribbon onto the diamond print design and stitched it down. I also did this around the edge of the apron. The bodice construction came next, and I began by making gathering stitches along the shoulders on both front and back panels for the lining and fashion fabric. The front panel is also gathered along the waist and drawn down to 3 inches. The side seams are then pinned and stitched together. I prepped the front and back bodice panels, which are 2 triangle pieces of fabric cut on a bias. I attempted to put piping on them, but it was super difficult, and the end result looked way too messy for my liking. So I used the bagging out method, being sure to clip corners, and then it pressed it, stitching the remaining opening by hand. They are then trimmed in the same way as the front apron. The stitches at the shoulder seams are gathered down to 3 inches on both fabrics. Next, I put the lining and fashion fabric together, pinning it in place, matching seams, raw edges, and gathering placements. I piped 2 bias cut strips of fabric for the shoulder straps that secure the gathers. The raw edges are together, right sides of the fabric facing, making sure that the piping covers my gathering stitches. I then stitch next to the piping. I inserted the front and back panels by setting the edges in between the layers of fabric and lining, pinning them in place. These were previously pressed inward so that the edge is nice and finished. On the back, this is only done on the left side, leaving the right side open for closures so I can actually get into this dress. At this point, I decided I wanted piping in between the panels and the bodice, so I carefully unpinned the top layer of fabric, making sure to repin my already carefully set panels back to their lining. I stitched the piping in by machine and repinned the fabric in place and stitched all the layers together by machine also. I really could have saved myself a step and simply basted the front and back panels to their lining instead of bagging them out, but at the time I had no idea these edges would be encased in a layer of other fabric. This pattern is from Patterns of Fashion and it hardly has any instructions, so I'm figuring it out as I go. Oh well, at least the perfectionist me has the satisfaction of knowing how neat and tidy all those they are inside all those layers of this dress. Matching lace trim was then added to cover the visible top stitching and to add some more character to this already busy gown. Because that's what the 1830s are all about, right? Over-the-top ridiculousness that is absolutely wonderful. I went on to the sleeves and I transferred all important markings and stitched 2 lines of gathering stitches by machine, 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch from the raw edge. The lining and the satin are made up as one layer. These stitches only serve to stiffen the edge and to secure the layers together because the double fabric is way too thick to gather by machine stitches. The thread snaps like immediately. So another row of large gathering stitches was made by hand in between the other 2 lines, and the sleeve head was gathered down to fit the arm side. The sleeve slash is cut before the sleeve is fully gathered down, and bias binding is stitched on, finishing the opening. The sleeves are set in place, matching the mark on the sleeve head with the center of the shoulder strap on the bodice. The fabric is pinned right sides together and gathers are distributed evenly. I then stitch the sleeve in by hand since the fabric is now super thick and this gives me much greater control. Now that the bodice assembly is completed, I decided to finish up the skirt details. I started by hemming, which involved turning the raw edge up by 1/2 inch, pressing it, then turning that edge over once again and pressing it. I then stitch it down by machine. Normally I do hems by hand so I can hide the stitching better, but this will be covered by trim anyways. For the bottom decoration, I cut a 5-inch wide strip of bias fabric that is 120 inches long. I sewed 5mm piping into each side of the bias strip. This will give the hem extra structure. Unfortunately, this puckered way more than I was happy with, but sometimes that's the way it goes. And by this point, I didn't feel like redoing it, so I'm living with it for now. The bottom edge of the trim was placed just over the hem stitches and pinned down. Instead of stitching the trim on by itself, I decided to stitch the lace on at the same time and save a step. The moment has finally come to attach the bodice to the skirt. I matched up the center front points on both and pinned from the center out to each side, being careful to ensure that those gather stitches at the front are covered. The bodice ended up being way too large in the back, so I gathered the panels down until it matched the waist measurement of the skirt. The bodice is then stitched onto the skirt by hand. I'm using very tiny stitches and making sure they only go in the crease created by the piping. The excess bodice fabric is trimmed down to fit inside the waistband. A facing is cut, edges ironed in and pinned down. The raw ends of the waistband and facing are turned in and the edges are made even. This is all secured in place using whip stitches. I didn't film that part, but I did catch me trimming the waist. The lace was secured in the same way as the rest. The front apron is then sewn on over the waistband. I now line the shoulder bands and attach them just like I did the waistband. The 4 collar panels are then made up in the same way as the apron, front, and back panels. They're trimmed out and stitched along the piped edge of the bodice and slightly secured at the shoulder edge. They do not meet on the shoulder. There is a gap where the shoulder band is, and that makes a nice split. The raw edges of the arm side are bound with bias tape in the usual manner. Normally, I trim down the seam allowances of arm size because the gatherings are really full, but in this case, I needed that stiffness to hold out the puff of the sleeve since I don't have any sleeve supports. And also the fabric, I really just didn't want it to end up fraying and me to lose my gathering stitches and for things to come apart. So in this instance, I decided to not trim any of the excess fabric and leave it all hidden inside the bias tape. Lastly, closures are sewn into the back of the bodice and the skirt. I used hook and eyes for the main closures, but at the waistband, since there's a lot more tension and I want it to be held a lot more securely, I used hook and bars. And with that, this gloriously ridiculous 1830s evening dress is completed. I'm honestly fairly happy with how it turned out considering I was figuring out this pattern entirely as I went along. It ended up being a little bit too large for me. When I'm wearing it, it kind of slides off my shoulders too much and I find it's too big in the front and back bodice and the waist definitely gapes away from me, but that's okay. I'm honestly planning on selling this dress anyways, but it was a really fun project to make. I definitely like to do more 1830s dresses in the future. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you thought down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you all. If you would like to see more content like this, a like and a subscribe would be great. Thanks so much for being here. Until next time. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you thought down in the comments. I'd really love to hear from you all. If you would like to see more content like this, a like and a subscribe would be really great. Thanks so much for being here. Until next time.